about a place in San Francisco.
It's our next foray into not only a new style of jeans, but a new reproduction of an old style. In today's subject, I think we're going to talk about the J.Crew reproduction of the giant fit Chino.
Yeah, I think the purpose of it is really to do a deep dive into like maybe what inspired the pant, and also if we like it. We're sitting here with Ted Barrow. Why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm a pants wearer, and I think probably have spent a lot of time thinking about overthinking and overanalyzing pants.
I think you modeled for J.Crew.
I did model for J.Crew. Yeah, I'm an insider in that respect, but that was kind of in their glory.
I think if anybody's qualified to speak on the subject, it's Ted Barrow. So.
Yeah, thought a lot about J.Crew and their arc.
So when's the last time you bought a pair of J.Crew pants?
2015.
With the Barrow fit?
No, still thought it was acceptable to wear slim fit jeans, and it was a pair of black twill 5-pocket jean pants. And shortly after, it was like, this is too much.
Are we talking about the giant fit Chino, Tom?
Hit me up and you said, listen, there's this phenomenon going on. Everyone's talking about it. Most of them
every menswear publication has probably written something about the J.Crew giant fit Chino.
This is why you kind of wanted to dive into it. It was super surface level, and no one really had a context. There's this thing, it used to be popular, and you know, pants are big now, so it kind of makes sense. And that was like the depth.
The concept of something that's not slim fit being in like a mall store is somewhat controversial. You know, like they're only covering the fact that people were wearing wider jeans or chinos. And I think that's something that's been happening by people that are probably cooler than them for the past decade or so.
A beacon of the fact that like now Y-Fit is mainstream.
Yeah.
I think J.Crew is about 5 years behind the avant-garde or whatever fringy subculture that they're trying to take from or incorporate into mainstream. And so once you see it in J.Crew, it's gonna kind of stop being cool on kids. You know, I mean, they did the same thing with like, I hate this word, but heritage stuff of like 2010, 2011, and their resurgence where they made it cool to wear like selvage jeans and like Red Wing boots and you know that type of thing, and they played it out basically.
Were they selling like $300 selvage jeans? Or
they were.
Yeah, their Wallace and Barnes line is like that kind of stuff, Double RL or Filson or something like that.
The designer from Noah, he came out with his first collection. Like a staple in that collection is this giant fit Chino, which seems to be sort of like the centerpiece.
Some consulting with Ernest Sohn and would find like one of the last remaining like factories in South Brooklyn or something that still made clothing, moleskin trousers cut to like a 1940 silhouette with piping and all of this stuff. Like we were just starting to slim down. Ernest Sohn, they were doing like slimmer jeans, but it was very forward thinking because that sort of became the blueprint for, amongst other things, Noah. And Noah's sort of known as having a more traditional, like more classic cuts, wider leg pants, pleats, tweeds, high quality materials with a thoughtful narrative. And so I think like J.Crew is sort of doing the same thing that they've been doing, just now stripping away all the bells and whistles, and now you just have like a looser fitting Chino.
Right. It's based in this sort of like waspy New England culture, but sort of founded in his maybe childhood of being a skateboarder and being into punk rock and being into these sort of counterculture movements. Like, what do you think of him going to a big box retailer and bringing some of the like designs, but leaving some of the sort of ethical consumption philosophies?
Noah exists because if you like, most of the pants there are like $260 and up, even jeans. Yeah. And it really makes you think like, how many pairs of this should I have and how often should I wear these pants? And I think that's a very good way to think about wearing clothing. To take the kind of silhouette without the materials and without the story and without the commitment to sourcing these things ethically it seems a little bit cynical. It serves him well because it helps. Maybe if people are like, oh, these pants are great, who does this? If people even research that, they're going to go over to Noah. It also gives J.Crew some much needed kind of like cachet in that intersection between like streetwear and a big fashion house that Noah represents. I can't help but feel a little bit cynical about it though.
like leveraging an artistic underground movement or style of doing things and putting like a big box, like you were saying, like a big box format on top of it and commercializing it, and maybe that's like the transition to like J.Crew appropriating Noah style.
Yeah. So why don't we like go back into like the history of chinos and khakis so that we can look a little more closely at this.
If denim was like the utility of the miner, this is the utility of the soldier, and not just utility from a wearing perspective, but from a production perspective. They would source this Chinese twill, and so that's where the chino comes from.
The fabric would come from.
Exactly.
Is that where the name came
That's
from?
where the name comes from as well. They needed something that was like, not bogging them down and that they could build really quickly.
Like a streamlined, efficient uniform.
Yeah.
Made with breathable, functional fabric.
Exactly. Very lightweight. A lot has changed. One thing I think that's stuck with the chinos throughout time is that like 8 or 7 to 10, 11 ounce.
Yeah.
The utility obviously was movement and warfare. Well, and also the camouflage at the time. And it was really cheap and easy to make. So much so that like the original chinos, there's no pockets. So it was,
just like
4 seam lines basically to making the pants, and they could just slap them together. Everyone had the same fit. A lot of those traits kind of carry through, and it's funny comparing this to a lot of denim companies. A pair of jeans is almost the opposite of that. You've got a coin pocket, you've got rivets, like there's all of these details, like the most details of any pants you can think of, and this is almost
like details that people almost like fetishize and like obsess over because of the way that they like wear, and chinos aren't celebrated in that way. And it's because maybe they were more of just like a streamlined, basic, like efficient garment that people used as a part of their uniform that was more functional.
Yeah.
Military context is important. Also, the industrial context is important, which is that like up until about the 1830s, people, if they could afford pants, were having their pants tailored to them.
Yeah.
It wasn't factory production of industrial production of like clothing. 1840s, 1850s, you start to see department stores in Europe, and you start to see these things being sold that aren't bespoke, that are mass produced. Khaki comes in right at this time, and the color khaki.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure about the material. It could have been linen. That comes out of like British military campaigns in Egypt, in Abyssinia or Ethiopia, in India. Not sure where the term khaki comes from. It might be like coming out of this context.
Yeah.
And so there is this weird thing in the early 20th century where khaki then all of a sudden is kind of fetishized. There is this colonialist context, an association with like Western white conquest of other people and in tropical or temperate regions. Part of the mythology, when we look at the popularity of chinos and khaki later, it becomes more complicated. Ivy League thing, and with in chinos meaning a certain, like signifying something then, and it's kind of like a conservative era. It's like to me, it's very hard to make chinos cool.
We get jobs, then we get the khakis, then we get the chicks.
That's what I think we're really getting at, is like the J.Crew wide leg chino or whatever, the big chino, like getting Brennan to design this pant is an attempt to keep something that is fundamentally uncool, which is preppy wear, cool. Being a prep is not fucking cool. Like being rich isn't cool. So
do you think from like the origin of khaki, maybe some of the functional history of why the garment was created, it was always in the context of being like waspy sort of person who's in
I think so. It's really interesting that like khaki became like part of the British military uniform right around the same time that like they realized like, hey, maybe we shouldn't have these red coats. And that partly has to do with like organic dye of cochineal like being phased out and a chemical dye being applied, and up until that point they were getting this dye from like Oaxaca or whatever. The modern military uniform going from like dressing like a fucking Zouave or like a Tunisian, like an Algerian soldier with these big billowing pants that made you a horrible easy target, to camouflage, to blending in. But also like having khaki at that time in Europe and England meant that you had been to India or America. The States kind of like continues that, particularly the way that it's been used in brands. Like
it's like an elitist fabric and pant.
It's a conservative fabric and
Okay.
I don't think it's an elitist one. It's cheap to make, and it represents something that I think is like, it's not a subcultural thing.
Yeah. This interesting distinction from like military to academic culture, and then ultimately into like the 80s, where I feel like chinos, there's a sharp contrast between like maybe the 80s Ivy like banker culture, and then maybe like people wearing tighter or looser fitting jeans that were dressing in a more like alternative way. Chinos in the 80s were probably a symbol of like, maybe conservative people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Back against like military, like combat boots, camouflage, leather jackets, all that sort of stuff being used by the subculture, be it hippies or punks. It's like hip to be square, so it's khakis and polos. I mean, the emergence of like Ralph Lauren and polo is fetishizing waspy New England traditional culture by tweaking it a little bit and like making it a little more extreme. Big ties, deliberately nostalgic kind of cuts and fits. And like Annie Hall basically, like Great Gatsby in the 70s. Like, why are they looking back to the 1920s and the 1930s? And why is Ralph Lauren so popular at that point? It's partly because it's a time of optimism between the wars, and it's also a time when things were still being made in America, and it's a time when there could be these like tycoons and industrialists and titans of the industry that are sort of evoked by polo. And I think that sort of preppy resurgence in the 80s. What did a prep in the 70s look like? Like it was not even a thing really.
Yeah.
Like, or the 60s.
And
Waspy people were preppy,
but
the marketing of that was a product of finance, capitalism, and deregulation under Reagan in the 80s.
Yeah.
Which is when you start to see these like attempts by companies like the Gap to promote chinos.
The James Dean stuff, because that, when you're researching this topic, that is like the classic, like this is the first resurgence of khakis, and you're saying that was like a rose-colored narrative that that Gap put on.
Yeah, like
the conspiracy.
It had like Kerouac, Andy Warhol, James Dean, almost exclusively white men wore khakis. But it's like the Gap is trying to like kind of extend this, like be like, hey, we make this thing that all these great artists and thinkers and people who define the 20th century wore casually. Yeah. That's what we're doing. There were only like two kinds of pants back then. It seemed to me like that ad campaign, and I do kind of remember seeing that and being like, oh, khakis, and then being like, oh, those are khakis, that's so boring. Yeah. You know, like very flimsy attempt at like a big brand to sort of make the boring things that they were making seem relevant by finding these images. Okay, yes, Andy Warhol wore khakis. The picture that they have of Andy Warhol wearing, that's not the Andy Warhol that anyone knows about. Yeah. We think of Andy Warhol as wearing like Levi's and a wig. And
there are just things that you have to buy or you have to wear that aren't indicative of like your style. Like if you're buying Birkenstocks or something like that, it's not really like I'm a Birkenstocks guy. It's like I would wear it around the house or whatever. And someone might have a picture of you wearing those Birkenstocks. But does that mean that you're like Nick the guy who wears Birkenstocks, or are you just fucking want some comfortable pair of shoes?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I think I always remember talking to my dad about like the Gap and Banana Republic in the 80s and 90s. He was like, no one wore khakis because they were just like old people. Yeah. By wearing this like basic uniform, you're actually being cool or different in comparison to wearing something like super loud.
To me, that just seems like a conservative retrenchment.
I just saw Ted's comment that this type of quibbling by boring preppy fucks makes my skin crawl. Just snuck that one in there.
Yeah.
I was just saying, which to give context was like a quote I found from some blog where some guy was like, with origins in the military, no cuffs are the way they were originally worn. This works best by far if you are wearing them very casually and worn in. The trad ideal, however, is cuffed about 1.75 inches.
Yeah, I mean, that's just like, so what are you worried about losing if you're worried about the 1.75 inch cuff? Like, I love that people think about that, but then I'm like, why do people think about that?
But I think like in the same way that somebody who skates has to wear their t-shirts inside out and their pants wide and or slightly above their shoe, like these people who are on Ask Andy About Clothes probably care about that.
Everything that we wear when we skate, we think this makes for the most optimal experience as while you're skateboarding.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, if it's tight pants, it's like we think that looks best then, and we don't notice how constricting that is for movement. And now that we're all wearing looser pants, we think, oh, this like we can move around and it looks better. We have a cooler silhouette while we're skating.
Yeah.
And it's like we've used these like completely artificial ideas to validate and justify like why we've changed style so completely. I'm just curious as to why outside of skateboarding, what sort of reasons there are that people like think that much about a cuff. Deep down, we know it really doesn't fucking matter.
Yeah,
but we like invent all these ideas where there's a shared common like thing where we start to notice like, oh man, Mike Carroll always looks great, and like, he mostly wore khakis and they were usually 2 sizes too big.
I used to tell people that the reason my pants were so tight is because it helped protect my shins.
What a crazy,
Like, right?
Yeah.
And like,
my little interventions to this conversation were just like, where does that meaning come from, and why are we thinking about these things? You know?
I used to think about like how I fit into like a trend or a norm at the moment, and like how I can like kind of make my body work with that.
Mm-hmm.
But through this, I've actually discovered like the best looking things are things that just look good on my body.
Yeah.
And like if it's just a white t-shirt, as long as it's the right shoulders and comes down over them correctly, that actually could look better at any time period. So it's just a funny concept to have something that's like, this is the perfect cuff when like everybody's a fucking different height.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. It might be interesting to sort of see like how the Gap tried to instituted chinos and khakis into the mainstream.
yeah.
The Gap moment is probably the biggest moment.
Yeah.
A lot of the stuff came from when Mickey Drexler, who's credited with like reinventing the Gap, but previously reinventing J.Crew, created the khaki campaign, and I think he was trying to make the Gap really cool again. Had this like huge campaign to promote khakis.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things they did was to offer traders on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange khakis instead of the traditional suits that they were supposed to be wearing.
Do you think through doing that, they were trying to say that like khakis are a symbol of like rebellion against what Wall Street is?
Yeah.
That's kind of weird though, because it's like such like a conservative garment.
Right.
So
I mean, outside of like the AIDS protests and stuff like that, like riots and protests after Rodney King's death, there weren't a lot of big protest movements on Wall Street in the 90s when this happens. And to me, this looks like this like just absurd publicity stunt to get people to fucking care about khakis. Like,
They said that it came from this like, you know, underground artistic culture, and it was almost like instead of, I mean, this is the debate we had last night. Is it that like we're bringing the avant-garde of this like thing that has been the case for so long with like stylistically beautiful people to Wall Street, or is it we're opening up our market and now we're commercializing it for this like group of people who probably were going to buy our clothes anyways?
Yeah.
And I think it's the latter, but it's just marketed as the former.
Yeah, I just don't see any like cultural avant-gardes ever occurring or even being successfully conveyed by a company like the Gap. Ever, you know?
yeah.
I don't remember any descriptions of Dean Moriarty's khakis in On the Road.
Yeah.
Or actually a fucking Andy Warhol screen print of someone's pants. That being the point, you know?
Yeah.
And then not soon after, ironically, they had this, that was like the Jumpin' Jivin' campaign, where I don't know, you can play it on the video or something, but it's like all these people dancing. It was like, I guess swing music was really big at that time period, like the resurgence of swing music.
That might have been maybe a similar thing where it wasn't big, but they were like, look at this cool thing, everybody's swinging now. You know?
Well, there was a kind of, but that's again, like, it's the 90s and people are now looking back to the 40s. Nostalgic impulse for a time when you weren't born. I can't believe this was like 1997. Is that when it was?
Super rebellious.
This famous ad campaign where they would destroy their stores and drive like cars into their stores and stuff like that, and being like, we're changing retail to like bring it back to its roots. We're the fire starters.
Yeah,
when
we're
really
the
they're just
renegades.
commercializing everything.
Yeah, also it's really funny because the internet ended up actually just doing more, fulfilling the equivalent of driving something into a store.
There's two things about this that are kind of fucked up. Like, traders, number one, they're giving traders free clothes.
Right,
And
yeah, they
men get 3 shirts and 3 pairs of khakis.
Yeah.
Women, 2 shirts, 4 pairs of pants. What the fuck does that say?
Yeah.
And then also, it's not going to be in San Francisco. New York pigs. The pants are like a $90 wide fit, 100% cotton chino. I think it takes from some of the branding of when people said like the big Oxford or like the giant shirt.
Yeah, yeah.
Like Ralph Lauren did it, Gap did it. One length.
Yeah. While we're filming this, there's like all these Netflix things being kind of featured on the screen. And it's literally like Netflix making a series about Blockbuster Video. It's J.Crew making a pant for an industry that's like dead now. A nostalgic look back to the 90s when you could get a big pair of ugly chinos at a store. The reason why people started shopping vintage is because they wanted like a looser fitting pair of pants. And you can still get those. You can safely find them at a J.Crew.
Yeah.
And so
they're made for the people who are too scared to buy vintage, but are like dipping their toe in the idea of changing their fit from like a slim fit pant that they wear to work, right?
The pants are pivotal for the wrong reasons. Over the past 5 years, it's been cool again to wear vintage and used things because we've been looking for looser fits. J.Crew doing this is bad because it's now following that trend 5 years too late. We don't need more pants. There are already enough pants in the world. We can live off of vintage for the rest of our lives. In the same way that J.Crew democratized heritage wear, selvage jeans, Red Wing boots, etc., and made it ubiquitous, they're now trying to do that with the vintage skate world through Brennan. Noah pants cost $275, and that precludes owning more than one pair. Fast fashion is one of the worst egregious polluters in the world today. We don't need giant chinos from J.Crew. You want to imagine when you're buying it that this will be the only pair of pants that you're going to have. You're going to look like a fool. That doesn't actually happen in practice.
Yeah.
We all have 10 pairs of pants at the very minimum. And it's this idea.
Well, maybe not all of us.
Okay, a lot of us.
Of pants.
I don't know.
Do you have 20?
Okay.
I said
like 4.
Okay, good for you. Wow, I mean, that's commendable. 4 is probably all you need.
I think you bought 4 on this trip.
Now the last month has been really bad.
Okay.
It's just because I've been absorbing Nick's.
Yeah, but the appeal of brands like J.Crew is they promise you simplicity, but they're offering you so many options that you know, seeing it. They're like the Skechers of menswear.
Yeah.
When Skechers does a shoe, it's played out. You can move on.
Do you think that this pant launch is similar to like when they came out with the J.Crew Urban Slim?
The Urban Slim was based on like a helmet laying high fashion like flat fronted cotton twill pant.
It's gotten to like the apex of the trend cycle.
Right.
J.Crew has gotten to the point where they're like, we feel confident enough that we.
I think it's more
It's
just
sell a lot
we're
of them.
desperate enough that we have to do something like this.
Yeah.
Because J.Crew has no actual brand identity.
Yeah.
You know.
And that's
That's true.
moving away from how creative can we be into, okay, how much can we scrape the bottom of the barrel for stuff that has existed before?
Yeah.
And a Marvel movie, it's the same thing. It's just
Or a Netflix show about fucking Blockbuster.
Yeah, you can make good content with nostalgia. It feels so limiting, and it's especially so limiting in like you were saying, in fashion, where it's an actual physical good. It's not something transient. It's something you don't need, and it's something that's actually wasteful.
Yeah.
And there's a net harm to it.
Whatever we're being nostalgic about, like I would like to think that it was actually cool, you know. And like I think being nostalgic about large chinos is like kind of dumb. You know what I mean?
Like 90% of the fashion that exists out there is nostalgia-driven stuff, and it begs for like, well, where's the creativity and where's the new stuff for me to look to?
The environmental side of it, which is horrifying. There's the sort of lack of like something new and exciting, which is kind of a bummer, and the fact that it's pulling from these subcultures that are kind of new and exciting and youth-driven, and it's just. And to me, there's too much of a like conservative history and associations with khakis and chinos in particular that make them like, I don't think that they should be as ubiquitous as they are. You know, because I do think that there are, whether we are conscious of it or not, there's a sort of ideology behind there that's sort of like, oh yeah, like, you know, dress like a soldier. In a romantic, where these romantic ideas of khakis, of, you know, windswept fucking colonists in the Sahara or whatever. Like I think that's a very, even if that's so far removed from our actual daily experience of khakis, that's where it comes from, and we should be a little more critical of that.
For a $90 pair of chinos, I kind of broke out some ideas.
Yeah.
What I think I would at least be looking at when making a purchase like that. I just think at this point, because something like a chino is so accessible through either vintage or through like companies that make incredible sort of like small, really thoughtful clothing, is this thing that's coming into my life going to be worth it? And is it,
what are the alternatives?
if you're gonna go vintage, the pants that they're probably modeling these after is like old Dockers or like old Ralph Lauren stuff, or like vintage LL Bean, which is extremely accessible and, you know, sub like $30 on eBay. I don't know if you want pleated, if you want flat front, if you want them to be wide, if you want them to be straight, if you want them blue or khaki, like these are accessible and something that will look ultimately a lot doper than
all that stuff. It can all be bought for under $30 if you're smart about it. And if they're not reinventing the wheel, so if you're gonna spend more money, make sure like what you're buying is like kind of unique and fits you well.
Yeah,
you know?
for sure.
I mean,
ethical consumption or
exactly.
something like that.
Yeah.
What do you think, Tom?
I don't even know if it's nuanced enough to have this big announcement, really. It's
that's why it was annoying about it to me, is like these are deliberately ill-fitting clothes that aren't going to look good once this trend passes, and now a giant, whether they're bankrupt or not, a giant retailer, a big fashion house for men's clothing at least, is like popularizing this, and it just seems like a terrible waste.
They're desperate.
It's just like dinosaur gasping for air, sinking into the mud.
Go vintage, which is super easy and accessible, and you're gonna look much cooler, and it's gonna probably fit better, and you'll know how it's gonna wash, and you'll feel better about yourself for not going to the mall and like buying something that you'll throw out in a couple weeks, right?
Yeah.
Maybe made in USA. Like a ton of those chinos are made in the United States, and
I mean,
if you like that, then that's cool. On the smaller brand side, I mean, there's a ton of brands that make really cool chinos. Now, if you're gonna buy like that style trad chino, I would say that something like a J.Press is kind of the gold standard.
J.Press is good. I like Universal Works, Days March.
Yeah. I've always loved this brand Henry's. A pleated chino, but in like a duck canvas, which I think is kind of like a contradiction, considering like a like a pleated chino is normally a khaki.
That's where it should be. Like if you're gonna do something a little bit different, or you want to sort of reinvent the wheel a little bit, do it in a different material. You know, like
totally.
I'm interested in seeing like a chino cut in a thicker twill or a denim.
You're not gonna look different if you buy the J.Crew giant fit chino. Yeah. But you will look unique if you buy something vintage that nobody has, or something you buy something that's
most
unique.
People don't buy. Yeah.
Exactly. From a small brand, who cares about it? And then I don't know. I actually really liked the Stephen Allen chino, which was the same thing, where it's like you have this extreme taper, which is more of a Japanese style.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
But like, what I think is cool is that for a flat front chino that's wide, and you want to wear it short, I think that this style actually looks a lot better than like a giant box with the giant fit chino. Maybe it's a little aggressive, but
it's like
at least has character.
I thought it was unique. You know, it's around the same price.
Yeah, chinos are supposed to like, they're supposed to be roomy and comfortable in the thigh, kind of give your body some shape, and the taper is important, I think.
Yeah. Something like a Ben Davis original fit or like an LL Bean chino will always be there.
Maybe.
And maybe.
Yeah, I mean for skateboarding, those are great.
Sure.
And like at least with Ben Davis and LL Bean, although Ben Davis is basically like a strange 19th century jean. You're not paying more than $60, which is important too. It's just like, don't be afraid to get cheap shit. It's fine.
For sure. I think my favorite pants are like sub $20.
Yeah.
You know, it's all about like how they fit. And
the best advice my old girlfriend ever gave me was, I remember coming home with like a pair of APC jeans, and she was just like, "You're better than that. You know, don't just wear Levi's. It's, you know, it's they're fine. No one cares what you're wearing. Like, and you look good in $40 jeans. You don't need to pay $140 for a pair of jeans." And I thought that was very, very nice of her to say, and it also just very good advice. Is like, just change the orientation to like who's making it and why, to like whether it works for you.